Welcome, 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 everybody. So glad to be here with all of you tonight. Should be yet another great late night conversation. So hit the like button, hit the subscribe button, hit the notifications bell. We're back and we're having another late night chat. So let's do it.
Of the American century. I say that the century on which we are entering can be and must be the century of the common man.
A radical redistribution of economic power.
I mean, we know that racism is just a byproduct of capitalism. Everything would be all right if everything was put back in the hands of the people.
We need a government that will make sure Americans are taken care of and organize the economy to serve the people, not the profits of a wealthy few.
We now have the techniques and the resources to get rid of poverty.
We got to start getting out there with the people.
Get out of the movement and get to the masses.
We need a government of action.
Welcome, 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 everybody. So glad to be here with all of you. We're going to have another one of our great late night chats. It should be good. Glad you're all here. A lot of exciting things are coming up. Tomorrow night, I will be having a live streamed conversation with none other than Rainer Shea, the notorious internet communist Substack writer. He's gotten some notoriety for taking pro-China positions, for defending the Rage Against the War Machine rally. He's going to be on this channel tomorrow night. So tune in. Don't miss it. Bring your friends, bring your family. It's going to be awesome. What else is new? Well, we're getting ready to announce our plans for the fall in Portland, and that's going to be exciting. Stay tuned for that announcement after our Center for Political Innovation general membership meeting on Saturday. We will be announcing the planned conference in Portland, which is very exciting. We're going to be having a national conference of the Center for Political Innovation in Portland, Oregon, and that's going to be pretty awesome. So we got a lot of things going on. Right now, we are streaming on Rockfin. We are streaming on YouTube, and we're streaming on Rumble. And so hit the like button, hit the subscribe button, hit the notifications bell. And I guess the next thing I'll do is just very quickly, very quickly, I will find out, if we can, I'll just quickly summarize for those who may not be aware. The way we do things on this channel is I give my opening remarks for the first hour or so, sometimes more, sometimes less. I talk at you all, and I tell you what I think is important to talk about, what is on my mind. And then we do a roll call where we find out who's on the other side of the camera, who's watching. That is always very exciting. It's always very, very exciting to see who is on the other side of the camera, who is watching. And then after that, I answer people's questions for the rest of the night. I answer people's questions for the remainder of the show. It is me responding to things that people have asked me throughout the program. So that's the idea. So if there's something you want me to talk about in the second half of the show, something you want me to comment on, a question you have, whatever's on your mind, what you should do is during my opening remarks, you should, if you're on YouTube, send me a super chat. If you're on Rumble, you should send me a Rumble rant. If you are on Rockfin, you should send me a Rockfin tip. And I will then answer your question in the second half of the show. That's how it works. So if whatever it is you want me to answer, whatever's on your mind, whatever questions you have, shoot them my way. I will type them down as they come in, and then we'll do the roll call. And then in the second half of our show, boom, 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 I will give you some kind of answer. Now, Every so often, I get asked a gross sexual question or something, and I just can't answer it. But for the most part, if people just ask me what's on their mind, ask me to comment on world events, if you ask me about something I know about, I will answer it. That's the way it works. So, folks, with no further ado, I will jump into my opening remarks for tonight. I'll be writing down people's questions, their Rumble rants, their super chats, their Rockfin tips as the questions come in. And that's the way we do it. That's the way it works. So hit the like button, hit the subscribe button, and hit the notifications bell. First question already came in. All right. There we go. And there we go. There we go. First question. So there you go. More questions. Keep them rolling in. And on that note, I will jump into my opening remarks for tonight. Folks, imperialism is the most important word for any of us to understand. Imperialism is the most important word for any of us to understand. Imperialism is what it's all about. And if anyone starts talking to you like they are a Marxist, if anyone starts talking to you like they are a socialist, if anyone comes to you and starts talking to you like they are some kind of revolutionary, and the first thing that comes out of their mouth is not some kind of understanding that we must fight against imperialism, then they are not legit. They're not doing what needs to be done. Imperialism is what we are up against. Imperialism is not a policy. Imperialism is not an action. It's not something that countries do. It's not an issue. A lot of people have it in their heads that, well, I'm against racism. I'm against the oppression of LGBT people. I'm for workers' rights. I'm for women's rights. I'm also against imperialism. Yeah. No. Not how it works. That is not how it works, my friend. There's a lot of people that think imperialism is a bad thing. It's a bad thing when a country is imperialist, right? When a country invades another country or a country colonizes another country and they're being imperialist, and that's bad. And I don't want my country to be imperialist. Nope. Wrong. Imperialism is a system. Let me repeat that. Imperialism is a system. And I will read to you from the manuscript of my upcoming book. I will read to you the definition that Vladimir Lenin gave of imperialism. I'll just read it to you because it's pretty gosh darn important. The definition of imperialism is what it's all about. It's all about opposing imperialism. So I will just read to you Lenin's definition of imperialism. I will just read to you what imperialism is. I can find the page that I put it on. There you go. There you go. Here we go. The definition of imperialism, according to Vladimir Lenin. Imperialism is monopoly capitalism, parasitic or decaying capitalism, moribund capitalism. The supplanting of free competition by monopoly is the fundamental economic feature, the quintessence of imperialism. Monopoly manifests itself in 5 principal forms. 1, cartels, syndicates, and trusts. The concentration of production has reached a degree to which has given rise to these monopolistic associations of capitalists. 2, the monopolistic position of the big banks. 3, 4, or 5 giant banks manipulate the whole life of America, France, and Germany. 3, the seizure of the sources of raw material by the trusts and the financial oligarchy. 4, the economic partition of the world by the international cartels. There are already over 100 such international cartels which command the entire world market and divide it amicably among themselves. The export of capital as distinct from the export of commodities under non-monopoly capitalism is a highly characteristic phenomenon. It's closely associated with the economic and territorial partition of the world, and territorial partition of the world is completed. Those are the 5 stages of the development of imperialism, as Vladimir Lenin explained it. He's describing the rise of a system where trusts, cartels, and syndicates, an international financial oligarchy emerges, where banks become dominant and houses of finance dominate, where there is monopolistic concentration of wealth, and there is the export of capital rather than the export of commodities. Now, what is the export of capital? Under the industrial phase of capitalism, if you had a factory that made tires and they shipped products outside of the country would export tires. But now we export the tire making company. We don't export French fries, we export McDonald's. When the corporations themselves are exported across the planet, that is the export of capital. Instead of exporting commodities, we export the corporations. And these corporations engage in territorial partition, seizing corners of the world as their captive markets. This is imperialism, capitalism in its monopoly stage, the domination of the world by big banks and corporations based in Western countries that hold back economic development, that are seizing corners of the world for themselves. This is what imperialism is. Imperialism is a system, and we are up against imperialism, and it is our duty to oppose imperialism and bring imperialism to its knees. That is our job. And everything else is secondary. Everything else is connected to this. You want to talk about the emerging police state, the stripping away of our civil liberties? Well, did you know that the same corporation that manufactured tear gas that was shot at protesters in Ferguson, Missouri, also manufactures the tear gas and the rubber bullets that is shot at Palestinians by Israel? Did you know that the St. Louis Police Department's trained in Israel? Did you know that the same corporations that are involved in militarizing the police departments of the United States, selling police departments in America all kinds of body armor and equipment, they're also involved in sending weapons to Ukraine to escalate tensions with Russia, to kill people. Did you know that the big oil companies that are enriching themselves from America's natural resources are the same big oil companies that dominate the oil resources of Africa? That we are fighting against the concentrated wealth and the concentrated economic and political power of a small financial elite that is based in the Western countries, and that the Western capitalist governments are more or less the hired agents, the stooges of this international financial oligarchy. That there is a global economic setup where big banks and big corporations based in the Western countries hold back economic development around the world, keep countries poor, and drive countries, entire nations into poverty in order to maintain their economic dominance. And they enforce this system with war. War is the primary way they enforce this system. If a country breaks out of this system, they declare war against it, and they mobilize the military against it, and they invade it, and they overthrow it, and they reassert their control. Iraq had a Ba'athist Arab socialist government, and the United States claimed Iraq had weapons of mass destruction, and it did not. It was all a lie. And the USA invaded Iraq and reasserted economic control. Venezuela has faced relentless attacks from the United States because it has an anti-imperialist socialist government. The USA hates Russia and China because they have seized control of their countries economically, broken out of the domination of Western capitalism, and built themselves up. And that's the important thing to understand. What do countries do when they break out of imperialism? Build, construct. Before the Soviet Union came into existence, Russia was a very backward country. It had a primitive agrarian economy, was barely electrified. When Stalin came to power in Russia, it was build, build, build. Before the communists came to power in China, China was a very backward, primitive, industrial, non-industrialized country. They tried to assert their economic independence, and the British launched 2 opium wars to force them to join the imperialist global free trade system. But the communists came to power, and then it was build, build, build. And if you look at the parts of the world that are still under the domination of imperialism, those are parts of the world where building is not happening. Honduras, that's a Central American country where the imperialists still pretty much have control. And you've got whole swaths of territory, big chunks of the population that don't have running water, that don't have electricity, that live in shacks, that don't speak Spanish, that speak indigenous languages. Same for Guatemala. Guatemala is still under the control of the imperialists, and the people there are still poor, and the country is largely not electrified and not literate, and people are impoverished. Nigeria, the oil bankers have control of Nigeria, and Nigeria exports more oil than any other African country at this point. The Niger Delta region is vastly wealthy when it comes to oil, but the people there are largely illiterate, are largely impoverished. They have a low life expectancy. They don't have electricity. That is imperialism. Imperialism is a system. And when countries break out of imperialism, what they do is they build and they construct. And imperialism is all about preventing countries from building and constructing and forcing them to remain impoverished, forcing their wealth and their natural resources to go to the benefit of somebody else and to largely just remain unutilized. Imperialism is about keeping the world poor so that Wall Street and London can stay rich. It is about the export of capital. and corporations in the Western countries spreading their tentacles across the planet, preventing countries from utilizing their own natural resources, their own means of production, their own centers of economic power, preventing these countries from building themselves up, but instead reducing them to be captive markets or client states, where they have to purchase their products from Western corporations, where their economy is dominated by corporations that have been exported to them by the West. That is imperialism. Imperialism is an economic system. And the arrival of imperialism as an economic system completely changed Marxism. What Marxism was before the rise of imperialism and what Marxism is today are completely different. The rules completely changed when Lenin wrote his book, Imperialism, the Highest Stage of Capitalism, when the Bolshevik Revolution was victorious. And if you don't understand this difference, if you don't understand how things changed because of imperialism, you're missing the point. Marx wrote about the workers and the capitalists, the proletarians and the bourgeoisie, and how the factory owners were exploiting the factory workers, and how the factory worker was constantly competing with machines, and that the factory worker was constantly having his role in production reduced. The capitalist was replacing him with machines. And as a result, Marx predicted that there would be a great economic crisis that would come about as a result of technological innovation, reducing the role of the worker at the machine, at the assembly line. And that would then lead to the workers of Europe getting poorer and poorer and poorer, and the number of unemployed people in Europe getting greater, and the wages of workers in Europe going down. And eventually the workers of Europe would say they'd had enough of it. And in Germany and in France and in Britain and other places, the workers would seize control of their factories and seize control of the government, and you would have a communist revolution. And Marxism greatly expanded in the 1880s, in the 1890s, after Karl Marx's death. Marxism as a movement started to really expand. However, what Marxism predicted was not happening. In fact, the living standard of the working class in the Western countries was going up. So what was going on there? Why was this happening? This was the moment that they called a crisis of Marxism, because Marxism as a movement was growing bigger than ever before. Workers were forming unions. Socialist parties were getting elected to parliament. Karl Marx's teachings were being studied everywhere. Millions of people were joining Marxist organizations. However, you weren't seeing the economic catastrophe that Karl Marx promised. And you also were not seeing the workers' revolution that Karl Marx happened. Why? Because capitalism had gone from its stage of industrial capitalism to the stage of imperialism. And the corporations based in Germany and France and Britain and the United States were spreading all over the world. And they were using the third world to dump their excess commodities on. They were raking in profits by selling products to the third world, by colonizing the Philippines and Cuba, and by colonizing Africa and Asia, by colonizing the developing world, South America. The Western capitalist countries were creating a situation where the capitalists in the Western countries, who were now dominated by financiers and bankers, as bankers and financiers became dominant over the captains of industry, as bankers became dominant, and as American and British and French and German corporations spread all over the world, these corporations were not only making profits, they were making super profits. Super profits. Astronomically high profits. And the way they were doing that was they were subjecting not just workers, but entire nations in South America and in Africa and in Asia to super exploitation. They were keeping entire nations poor. The British Empire is responsible for over 100 million deaths in China because with their 2 opium wars, they forced China not to have its own economy. They forced them to allow free trade. They forced them to allow British corporations to put domestic manufacturers out of business. They forced them to allow the importation of opium to impoverish and addict their people so they could be slaves. Shanghai became a giant brothel where sailors from all over the world would go and rape little girls who were prostitutes. People starved to death because the fields that should have been growing food were instead growing poppies for the opium trade. And because of the British Empire, China was kept in underdevelopment, and people starved to death all the time, and people were hungry all the time. That's imperialism. The African continent. The African continent is a great showcase of imperialism. There are many, many examples of this. People seem to have it in their heads that imperialism is about development. That imperialism is, well, the Western capitalists go there and they invest and living standards go up. That's not true. Imperialism is the Western capitalist countries come in there and they put the country out of business. Imperialism is the export of capital, the domination of these countries by Western capitalists. Imperialism is when the British went to India and they burned all the textile looms. They forced the people of India who'd been growing and making their own cloth for thousands of years, forced them to import their cloth from British textile mills, from the British textile industry. Imperialism is NAFTA. With the North American Free Trade Agreement, the people of Mexico, who've been growing their own food for a long time, used to have a vibrant agricultural sector, are now in a situation where they import the bulk of their food from the United States. That's imperialism. And because of imperialism, capitalism in the Western countries began stabilizing in the 1880s and the 1890s. And so even though Marxist and communist ideas were everywhere, the economies of these countries began to stabilize. And that led to what was called the crisis of Marxism. And it was Vladimir Lenin and the Bolsheviks that had the understanding that imperialism was the reason. And one of the main ways that imperialism was able to bring stability to the Western countries was by dividing the working class. Some of the workers in the Western countries got better pay than the others. The so-called skilled workers, the craftsmen, the tradesmen, they got higher pay and better living conditions. And so as a result, they were uninterested in having solidarity with the lower paid workers, the workers in the factories, the industrial workers. And that these trades, being a plumber or a pipe fitter or a carpenter, being in one of the guilds was often done very nepotistically. Even now, right? You had to have a brother or a cousin who would vouch for you. And a lot of these labor unions among skilled workers, because they were getting a higher wages, they said white people only. They said English-speaking people only. They said born in this country only. They said Protestants only. And that sections of the working class benefited from imperialism to some degree, because they got privileges handed down to them. The pipe fitters and the bricklayers and the skilled trades, the so-called skilled trades, they got privilege handed to them. And as a result of that, they began to sympathize with their bosses and become more hostile to the industrial workers and the factory workers. And this is what Lenin referred to as the aristocracy of labor. These are working class people. They're still being exploited by their boss. They don't own their own means of production, but they are getting a higher wage. And that higher wage changes their consciousness. And so they're less interested in solidarity. And that's what happened in Britain. And that's what happened in France. And that's what happened in Germany. And that's what happened in America. As there was a stratification of the working class. As a result, the imperialists were making super profits. And as a result, they could afford to bribe a section of the working class. And it came in the form of higher wages. And on top of that, these labor unions that these so-called skilled workers were in, that these white workers were in, these English-speaking workers were in, these labor unions had been started by socialists, right? You read about the AFL, the American Federation of Labor in the United States. It was started by Samuel Gompers. Samuel Gompers was a Marxist originally, but as the workers in his union, who were in the so-called skilled trades, got better conditions, he became less and less revolutionary. And this happened all across Europe. And the labor leaders, the leaders of labor unions, and the leaders of socialist groups became less and less revolutionary because of the fact that they were representing a strata of the working class that was more privileged. And this all led to a disastrous event called World War I. In Germany, there was a huge, huge Marxist political party called the Social Democratic Party, led by Karl Kautsky. In France, there were many different socialist groups. In Britain, you had the Labour Party. All over the Western country, in America, you had the Socialist Party led by Eugene Debs. All over the world, you had Marxist and leftist groups all over the Western world. And they'd all gathered and had an international conference before World War I and promised that they would never support a capitalist war. Never would they support a capitalist war. Never would they support workers of one country being sent to kill workers of another country. Never would they do it. But in August of 1914, when World War I started, the German Social Democratic Party sold out and they supported the war. And the French socialists sold out and they supported the war. And the British Labour Party sold out and they supported the war. And party after party betrayed the working class and supported World War I. And why did they do it? They did it because they had been bought off. They did it because these socialist parties and these labor unions had become a part of the Western imperialist system. And that the higher wages that some of these workers received was a mechanism for stabilizing the Western world. Germany even had adopted national health care as a way of stabilizing German society. They'd created kindergartens. You know the word Kindergarten, right? It's German, kindergarten. They'd created kindergartens where the kids, they got to learn to march around and wear uniforms and be militarized at a young age. And that many of the reforms that the socialists had fought for in Germany were utilized to stabilize German society and prepare it for war. And the socialist parties that had been bought off by imperialism betrayed the working class and launched World War I. And that is called the aristocracy of labor. And that is a key aspect of imperialism. And Vladimir Lenin was furious about this. He fumed with rage about this because it was an absolute betrayal of the working class. And I see Jamie Turner asking about super imperialism. It was an absolute betrayal of the working class that World War I happened. And Lenin said that calling out and opposing the reformist and pro-imperialist socialist leaders was the duty of the revolutionary movement. And that rather than trying to win over the reformist and pro-imperialist socialist labor leaders, it was the job of revolutionaries to go lower and deeper to the real masses. That's what Lenin argued. And that this whole understanding of imperialism as a system, imperialism as what we're up against, imperialism as corrupting the left and the labor movement. This is the Leninist understanding, and it is vitally important to what we are doing in our time. Because at this point, we are seeing imperialism in a long-term crisis. What Marx wrote about the worker being replaced with machines, that's back with a vengeance. Artificial intelligence has brought the problem of overproduction and the tendency of the falling rate of profits. It has brought that to a dramatic climax. There's no room for the worker at the assembly line any longer. Meanwhile, big sections of the world have broken free from imperialism. And that's what Lenin's whole point was. He said, when he wrote about imperialism, the highest stage of capitalism, that because of this divide and stratification of the working class, because of the aristocracy of labor, in his time, the revolutionary energy would not be in the West, but rather it would be in places like Russia and China and Vietnam and Africa. And he was right. The 20th century was defined not by workers' revolution in the Western capitalist countries, but by national liberation struggles in the colonized world. After the Russian Revolution in 1917, country after country started breaking free from imperialism. You had the Chinese Revolution, the Korean Revolution. You had the rise of Libya under the leadership of Gaddafi. You had the rise of Ba'athist Arab socialism in the Middle East. You had African socialism under the leadership of Kwame Nkrumah. You had African socialism in Tanzania under Julius Nyerere. You had so many countries breaking out of the domination of the imperialists. You had the Cuban Revolution and the Nicaraguan Revolution. You had country after country. You had, at one point, you had the Democratic People's Republic of Yemen, the DPRY. Half of Yemen broke away and became a socialist country. You had country after country breaking out of the domination of Western capitalism and utilizing state central planning and socialism to build itself up. And you had the imperialists mobilizing all their forces to invade these countries, to attack these countries. 4 million people killed on the Korean Peninsula. 5 million killed in Vietnam, in the Vietnam War, the devastating bombing that happened. A brutal military coup in Indonesia in 1965, killing 500,000 people, violently overthrowing the elected government of Indonesia. Many places, country after country after country, you saw the United States and Britain mobilizing the first world, the NATO countries, to do everything they could to stop the wave of national liberation struggles that were breaking out across the colonized world. All across the colonized world, countries were breaking free. And that was where the revolutionary energy was. And there was not revolutionary energy in the Western capitalist countries. Why? Because the imperialists were making super profits, because after World War II, you had a great economic expansion. And in the United States, you had the white picket fence and the house and the car and 3 kids and the nuclear family. And you had a level of economic prosperity in the imperialist homelands that was unprecedented. The way American workers were living in the 1950s was the highest of any workers in the world, because American corporations had spread themselves all over the world, and most of the Western world had been destroyed in World War II. And so American corporations had economic dominance in the world and were making such huge super profits that they could start paying not just the so-called skilled workers, but even the auto workers and the steel workers and the meat packers, paying them decent wages. And the wages of industrial workers in the United States went up very dramatically after World War II. And this was a way of buying class peace. And the bulk of the American working class, and the bulk of the British working class, and the bulk of the French and the German working class was not revolutionary because of the super profits of imperialism and because of the labor aristocracy, which greatly expanded after World War II. And so the communist and the socialist movements were forced to retreat. Average Americans were living high during that time. So the communists in the Western world, you'll understand, they focused on going lower and deeper to the real masses. They organized the black people to fight against racism. The communists built the Civil Rights Congress. Long before Martin Luther King Jr., they were out in the streets getting arrested, organizing for civil rights. And the communists built a peace movement because there were a lot of young people who were born into the middle class who didn't want to go fight in wars. And they started promoting pacifism, bourgeois pacifism, and saying war is not good, not opposing the war on a class basis because these people lived cushy middle class lives, but opposing it on a pacifist basis. Should we really be killing each other, etc.? You know, the political crisis of the 1960s, 1968, 1969, 1970, 1971, that crisis was largely a crisis of the black people who were kept in poverty, rebelling and fighting back, and often doing so in solidarity and sympathy with the colonized world. And it was a rebellion of young, middle-class young people who'd grown up in that 1950s house and car and that comfortable existence, not wanting to have to go and do something that's very, very working class and very, very unpleasant. Put on a uniform, subject yourself to military discipline, and go to the other side of the world and kill people in Vietnam. And so the communist strategy in the United States during those years was to focus on the oppressed black community, the oppressed black nation, and to focus on bourgeois pacifism. Because at that point, the living standard was so high that the broad masses of Americans didn't want to hear it. The communists had been banned from all the labor unions. Average Americans were conservative and supported the wars. And as a result, the communists were forced into the margins of society. They appealed to the resentment and oppression of the black community. They appealed to the alienation of middle-class youth, etc. But the class line was broken during this period because of the aristocracy of labor. That doesn't mean there weren't strikes. That doesn't mean there weren't exceptions to it. But largely, during this time period, in the Western imperialist countries, the class line was broken. And the imperialists saw this, and they intentionally manipulated it. They funded the Congress for Cultural Freedom program. They created leftist intellectuals. They funded, the CIA funded the Frankfurt School, Theodore Adorno and Herbert Marcuse and Susan Sontag and Mary McCarthy and Hannah Arendt. The CIA was funneling money to various leftist intellectuals who were anti-communist and pro-imperialist, but they were seizing on a reality that was already there. In America, the only people that were interested in communism during these years were young people that were nonconformists, that were trying to express their individuality, were going against the mainstream, trying to go against U.S. society, study the enemy ideology of communism, and the oppressed communities, the black community that was oppressed. Those were really the only people, right? Those were really the only people. The only people that wanted to hear about communism, that wanted to hear about Marxism. And so that led to a situation where there was a dramatic change in how leftists approached things. But I'm here to tell you tonight that this period of imperialist stabilization is over. This period of imperialist stabilization is over. In case you haven't noticed, Detroit has been shut down. In case you haven't noticed, the bulk of this country has been deindustrialized. In case you haven't noticed, living conditions in the Western countries are going down. Things are dramatically changing. Things are dramatically changing. And this creates a new opportunity. An opportunity to fight imperialism. An opportunity to resist and oppose the emerging low-wage police state. The opportunity to bring solidarity between the workers of the Western capitalist countries and the people around the world struggling for national liberation. The opportunity to actually defeat imperialism at its core, at its center. That opportunity now faces us. But it requires a new orientation. It requires breaking with the so-called left that has decided that the American working class is its enemy. A lot of things have changed. But one thing that remains is that there is still a fake left. There is still social democracy. There is still sellout reformist labor leaders, but they operate a little bit differently. In our time, imperialism has cultivated through its NGO apparatus and through the funding of various activist groups, it has cultivated a layer of people who feel that somehow it is their duty as revolutionaries to defend the imperialist system, to protect it from any right-wing opposition, to spread its values around the world, to help it overthrow various governments that might get in the way. They have come to that conclusion that that is their job. That is their duty. To be the foot soldiers of imperialism in the name of new woke values. That is the conclusion that they have come to. It's very disturbing. But it creates a new ballpark for all of us who take this seriously, all of us who want to see the imperialist system defeated, all of us who celebrate the fact that so many have been lifted out of poverty, so many countries have asserted their independence. All of us who celebrate the fact that this system of imperialism is on its way out, it's created a new task for us. Once again, it is our duty to go lower and deeper to the real masses. But who the real masses are has changed. Because with the decline of the industrial working class and the so-called industrial middle class in the Western countries, we have a new responsibility. We have a new layer of people that are alienated from the system. And it is our job to win over the American working class that is losing its homes and losing its jobs, seeing its living standard go down. It is our duty. It is our duty to win them to anti-imperialism and socialism, as difficult as that might be. And it is not our duty, let me add. I see there's a super chat that's coming on the Rockfin from Diane Freeland. Thank you very much. No question, just a super chat, and I appreciate it. It is not our duty It is not our duty to defend the left or try and be part of the left or be part of the so-called left. It is not our duty to do that. It is our duty to go lower and deeper to the real masses. And what that means changes. But we have to build a movement now because people desperately need a movement in this time. The only way conditions are going to get better, the only way the march of the low-wage police state can be stopped, the only way we can stop the drive toward war, stop the deteriorating conditions, is to build up a real working class movement. A real working class movement focused on jobs, healthcare, and education, on bringing people together, different nationalities, different backgrounds, different beliefs, focusing on an economic program to rescue the country, focusing on opposing war. This is our duty. This is our duty. And this is what we must do. And opposing imperialism is what it's all about. And being a genuine revolutionary anti-imperialist is not the same as being woke. Being a genuine revolutionary anti-imperialist is not the same as being a liberal. It's actually completely different. And what we're doing here is a completely different thing. We are opposing the Western capitalist imperialist system. We are celebrating the independence of countries around the world with the understanding that someday we will break our own country free. We will rebuild America beyond imperialism. That is what we are striving to do with every ounce of our being. With every ounce of our being. So on that note, I conclude my opening remarks for tonight to remind you that once again, it is all about opposing imperialism. That is what it's all about. To be a revolutionary in our time means opposing imperialism. That is our duty. Absolutely. Free Julian Assange. Drop all charges against the Uhuru movement. Build up an anti-imperialist united front. That is what it means to be a revolutionary in our time. That is what it means. Imperialism is our enemy. It's the enemy of all humanity, and we're fighting for a new world beyond that. A new world beyond imperialism. So names and locations, folks. Names and locations. I will call you all out as I see you. Who is with us tonight? Names and locations. Names and locations. I will call you out as I see you. Names and locations. Names and locations. All right. Sorry. John from Saskatchewan, Colin from Greensboro, Jamie in St. Paul, Molly McGuire in Orange County, Eric from Holland, Dustin Schlesinger, Rennie in England, Ian in Chester in England, Jamie in St. Paul. Got anyone? Oh, we got Jamie Turner in Boise, Idaho. We got Mike Hunt in Dayton, Ohio. We got Chris in Salt Lake City. We got Mima Flowers in Cleveland. Enoch in Australia. Alex from Brazil. Wellington from New Zealand. Fred in Alameda County. Welcome, Fred. Mwad, Atlanta, Georgia. Mwad from Atlanta, Georgia. Welcome, Mwad. Chris in Salt Lake City is with us. Welcome, Chris. Eatonville, Washington, Meredith. Mariah in North Carolina. Good evening. Lionel in Melbourne. Bob Troy in New York. Welcome, 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 everybody. Welcome, welcome, welcome. Names and locations. Oh, we got someone from Brazil, Itagia. We got Randall Wilson in Kentucky. We got Buffalo, New York. Names and locations. We got Neil Fraser in Hong Kong. Welcome, welcome, welcome. Scranton, Pennsylvania, Archer Jones. Tusker, Arkansas. Francis in Santa Fe, New Mexico. We got D. Freeland in Oklahoma City. Welcome, D. D is on the Rockfin right now. Jenny Lynn in Cincinnati. Edwin from the Philippines. David Rennie. Welcome, welcome, welcome. Welcome, welcome, welcome. Welcome, 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 everybody. Welcome, welcome, welcome. David Fox in Bendigo, Australia. Gabby Hernandez in Chicago. Welcome, Gabby. Patrick in Maine. John McCarthy in Chicago. Upper Pennsylvania of Michigan. Viking Dave. It's a wild time. This is a wild time, everybody. Sometimes it's easier to balance 100 different things than others. You got to keep track of everything. Got to keep track of different things. You got to be aware of different things that are happening. I've got a lot of different projects in the works. As you all are aware, I have a book that should be out very shortly, doing the arrangements to make sure that that is done. I'm very excited about it coming out. Got that going on. Got a lot of different projects happening. We're getting ready for a campaign to build CPI. Oh, we got Minden out in Midwest, Olympia Logic. We got Christopher in Texas. Have you heard about the Denver communists are doing? Instead of organizing workers, they're using their riches to protest a Christian coffee shop. Someone have an article. When I talk about that, it'd be good to have an article in front of me because I don't know the situation. So an article to back that up would be good. Mariah, if you could, maybe put an article below your super chat or something, that'd be good. I don't want to, I'm curious to learn about that. It fits a pattern. It fits a pattern that we've been hearing about for a long time. Christopher in Texas, Dan in Quebec, Viking Dave. All right, folks. All right. All righty. So I think now I will start to answer super chat questions. The first question, there's another question that's just come in now. Hemp Car says, the Panthers employed homeless to sell their newspaper. Are there any good leaflets to disperse? Okay. Thank you, Hemp Car. That's on the Rockfin. I'm putting that on the list. There we go. There we go. So, all righty. Well, why don't we now? So I've been doing. My arrangement lately is I've been doing Rumble rants first. I've been answering Rumble rant questions first. So why don't I do the Rumble rant questions first? Since that's what I've been doing. And the Rumble rant question I've gotten is from Jamie Turner. What about the super imperialism that Michael Hudson describes? I just got to tell you, I'm not familiar deeply with Michael Hudson's concept of super imperialism. I do know that, Lenin polemicizes against Karl Kautsky's concept of ultra imperialism in his book, Imperialism, the Highest Stage of Capitalism, where Kautsky was arguing there were no inter-imperialist rivalries that existed, etc. The age of inter-imperialist rivalries was over, which was a very bad prediction as World War I had happened. I know that Michael Hudson talks a lot about the financialization of capital, and he talks about a lot of things. And I have a lot of respect for Michael Hudson, but it's not on me to articulate his concept of ultra imperialism, because if I were to do that, I wouldn't do it justice. I would do it wrong. So there you go. There you go. I would get it wrong. And yeah, so there we go. So yeah, that's the first Rumble rant, is about Michael Hudson's concept of super imperialism. So next, I will start answering the questions that came in on the Rockfin, and the questions that came in on YouTube on the super chats. So the first one is, what divides big and small capital in terms of assets? Can you give an approximate value? No, I can't. Right? This is not a specific group, right? It's not like one can look at this and say, well, that's, there are certain entrenched families in the United States that have astronomical amounts of wealth, more wealth than you and I can ever imagine. If you talk about the Rockefellers, the DuPonts, the Carnegies, that old Eastern establishment, you're talking about people with so much wealth and so much power, they can't even calculate it. If you read Ferdinand Lundberg's book, Rockefeller Syndrome, he talks about how they can't figure out how much money the Rockefellers actually have. They can't figure it out because it's incalculable. It's wrapped up in so many different banks and trusts and investments. And the Rockefeller family is so astronomically wealthy. They talk about how, they publish this list of the richest people in the world. Well, everyone on that list is so poor, they keep their money in their own name. That when you talk about these wealthy dynasties that have a huge amount of power, that tend to be tied in with the oil and the banking sector, you're talking about people that have so much money, it's beyond calculation. Right? And there's a lot written about the rich and the ultra rich, about the Anglo-American establishment by Carol Quigley, that there is a layer of wealth in the United States, of families that are surrounded by other wealthy families that are in their circle, that the amount of money they have is beyond any calculation. And then on top of that, in America, we have over 1 million millionaires, right? We have a lot of people that are wealthy that are not part of that club. They just happen to be wealthy, right? For whatever reason, but they're not part of that elite club. And that is the fight. And there's no specific line, right? It's not like, I don't distinguish a specific line between them. I'm talking about the entrenched wealth and power that has ruled this country for generations, and other people who happen to have money. That's what I'm talking about. And there is a push and pull between them. And Carol Quigley, in his book Tragedy and Hope, talks about this push and pull, about the new wealth that's dependent on government. And all of this is discussed there. So there you go. What can we learn from Caleb and Joshua in the Bible? Right, that's my name, right? My first name from birth is Caleb. And so I'm supposed to be an expert on these things, right? what I understand, I mean, look, I am not an Old Testament guy, but my understanding of the story is that Caleb, according to the Bible, was a spy who was sent into the promised land, Canaan, by Joshua and others to see who the people living there were and what the battle would be like. And some of the people said that, that the people living there were giants, and some of the people, that's my understanding of it. It's been a long time since I've read that stuff. I did at one point, ask. I worked at an insurance company with many Hasidic Jews, and I asked, why are there no Jews named Caleb? Right, because it's an Old Testament Bible name. All right, writing it down. An Old Testament Bible name, and there's no Jews who have that name. Well, it was explained to me that it is actually two names in Hebrew. It's Chaim Levi. Chaim is 18. It means life. Levi is another Hebrew name. And so the guy that they're referring to, when they translated the Bible into English, they made it one name, Caleb, right? And if you speak Hebrew, it's actually two names, and that's why you don't see Jewish people with that name. Occasionally, you might see somebody who is like of Russian background, like a Russian Jewish person, and they'll have the name Khalev, Kalev, or something like that. But that's very rare, because in Hebrew, it's two different names combined into one, which I find to be fascinating, utterly fascinating. So there we go. Yeah, but I'm not a biblical scholar. I do know about, Joshua sent Caleb and other spies into the promised land. I don't remember the details about that story in particular, but there you go. All righty. Any comments on the New York Times and Marco Rubio claiming peace groups are Chinese communist agents? I mean, it's McCarthyism. It's horrible. It's awful. And I mean, this is the result. This is Russiagate. This is what Russiagate brought us. This is what all of this talk of foreign meddling and subversion. I mean, the fact that the left hasn't pushed back on it. I mean, the Uhuru case is so important. That is a test case. And if they can prosecute the Uhuru folks, they can essentially make it illegal to be an anti-war activist. So we got to support the Uhuru movement. We got to support them as much as we possibly can. I mean, there's not more to it than that. We got to support the Uhuru movement as much as we possibly can. And we've got to denounce this kind of neo-McCarthyism, because it doesn't make you a Chinese agent to want peace. It doesn't make you a Chinese agent to want to get along better. And Marco Rubio is a particularly awful figure. He's from that Miami Cuban crowd that's very anti-communist, very right-wing, very, very pro-interventionist. And Marco Rubio is a neoconservative, and this rhetoric is very dangerous. And yeah, I'm against it. I'm 100% against that rhetoric. So is Chinese imperialism possible if the CPC loses power? Well, a lot more would have to happen than just the Chinese Communist Party losing power. But that in and of itself would be a huge, dramatic change. A huge, dramatic change in China. But yes, if the Chinese Communist Party lost power, if the Chinese economy started functioning completely different, if you started to have big corporations in China that functioned the way an imperialist company did, if you had giant banks that financed them, if you had, this is, again, you're talking about a hypothetical here. A lot of things would really have to change in order for that to happen than just the Communist Party leaving power. There are plenty of countries in this world that are not socialist or led by communist parties that are not imperialist. I'm not saying that couldn't happen, but you're asking me, what if a really, really, really big geopolitical shifting, huge game changer happened? Could the result be something like this? Of course. I mean, it could be, but it could also be something else. I don't know. But, you're asking if the Chinese Communist Party could lose power. That's like a huge change. So there you go. All righty. Have you seen the propaganda film To Live? I have not. I know about They Live, which is a great movie from the 80s starring Roddy Piper. But what is To Live film? To Live is a 1994 film, also titled Lifetimes in some English versions, portrays a village during the Chinese Civil War up to the Cultural Revolution. Haven't seen it. But I take it this is an anti-communist film that portrays the communists in a negative light. I haven't seen it. I wasn't aware of this film. So there you go. They did make a movie called The Last Emperor that was kind of mixed. I thought it was not as anti-communist as it could have been. I thought it showed the Chinese Communist Party in a somewhat sympathetic light. It wasn't completely anti-communist. It showed the emperor of China being deposed. He was then a Japanese collaborator, was put in prison for being a Japanese collaborator. He was later rehabilitated and he becomes a gardener. I thought that film, I watched it, and I mean, it wasn't pro-communist, but I didn't see it as blatantly pushing anti-communism. It was just kind of, it was showing the communists in a somewhat negative light. But I mean, this guy was the emperor under the old system. And they not only did they not execute him, but they rehabilitated him and let him become a member of the country and the society. So, that film, and it's interesting how Hollywood portrays these things. I think there's Chinese history. I mean, there's a film called like The Violin, or was it called The Red Violin, and it portrayed the Cultural Revolution in a very negative light. It was about a violin and how it was it shows the Cultural Revolution in a very negative light, but it's not completely anti-China, I don't think. It's been a while since I've seen that movie, but it shows the Cultural Revolution in a very negative light. Like they're trying to destroy this beautiful violin because it's Western. It's interesting, I'm not a huge defender of the Cultural Revolution. I think the Cultural Revolution, I take, every Chinese person I've ever spoken to who lived through it, even some of the most pro-communist, have told me that it was awful. I've even met a few Chinese folks who think it was necessary, but they still think it was awful. It was pretty bad. It was a pretty hard time to be alive in their country, but I've met a few Chinese folks who lived through it, or their parents lived through it, and they said, well, it was necessary to prevent a counter-revolution. It was necessary to sweep away our past, but it was still awful. I mean, it was not a good time to be alive. And the minority of Maoist types who consider the Cultural Revolution to be a good thing, to be, some great achievement or something. They're pretty out of touch, because I've never met anyone who lived during that period or has ancestors who lived during that period who thinks that was a good time. I will say that, and like this book, for example, right? There are a couple books that are more positive, but even those books that are more positive, like this book, right? This is called Some of Us, Chinese Women Growing Up in the Mao Era, right? And it's worth reading. You get the perspective of a number of women who now live in the United States, who grew up during the Mao years and the Cultural Revolution, and they talk about some of the positives, right? They talk about some of the positives, how women were empowered, how they were encouraging people to engage with ideas. There was widespread discussion of communist ideas among the population. People were being encouraged to read and debate and discuss philosophy, things like that. So that, and there's a book called The Unknown Cultural Revolution that says similar things. And then, and of course there's a book called Daily Life in Revolutionary China that I have a copy of somewhere around here, that I read. I mean, it was published during the Cultural Revolution. It was by an Italian member of parliament who was a Maoist communist, Maria Mashiyoshi, and she describes it in glowing and positive terms. So there you go. All righty. There we go. All right, I'll do the Rockfin question first. Next, the Black Panthers employed homeless people to sell their newspaper. Are there any good leaflets to disperse, or FDS chapters doing anything? Well, Students for a Democratic Society doesn't really exist anymore. That was a 1960s political phenomenon. It was started by like kind of liberals, socialistic liberals, people that were associated with the League for Industrial Democracy. They started Students for a Democratic Society, and then later it became dominated by communist elements. You know, communists kind of took control of it. The Progressive Labor Party, the Revolutionary Youth Movement, the Weathermen. It collapsed at its 1969 convention. And for a while, the Weathermen tried to keep it going, and they called it Revolutionary Youth Movement, and Progressive Labor Party tried to keep it going as the Workers' Student Alliance, but it eventually fell apart. There is something that calls itself Students for a Democratic Society that's on the campuses now. That is not, I mean, it's a totally different formation. I believe it was formed in like 2006, and it was at this point it's almost entirely people from the Freedom Road Socialist Organization, which is a pro-democratic party group that, you know, I mean, look at what Freedom Road Socialist Organization and SDS does. I mean, they call themselves SDS, but what they focus on is trying to get college Republican clubs banned, arguing that Republicans are racist. They try to, you know, shut down Republican speakers when they come and speak on college campuses. You know, they're just liberals, and they're woke. And, you know, members of Freedom Road go around calling communists on the internet Nazis and fascists, and, you know, yeah, that's what Freedom Road does. So, you know, not hugely excited about them, but yeah, you know, I mean, but, you know, there are things that people can do, right? And we at the Center for Political Innovation, we've got palm cards people can distribute. And we have discussed various outreach techniques. And one thing we're going to start doing, we're going to start taking a survey, right? We are going to actually just have our members of the Center for Political Innovation go out and ask people questions and engage with people. We're going to have them take surveys. We're going to have them do that as a way of engaging with people and doing outreach. And so I'm in the process of preparing the survey with a few other people, and we're in part of preparation for our Portland campaign. That's one thing we're going to do, is we're going to start having surveys. We're going to start having surveys. So there you go. There you go. There you go. Asking people questions. So there you go. So the next question I've got, hold on. Hold on. The next question I've got here. Have you heard what the Denver communists are doing? Instead of organizing workers, they're using their resources to protest a Christian coffee shop. Okay, do you have the an article about this or something? And who are the Denver communists? Is this CPUSA? Is this some Maoist collective? Like, who are they? And do you have information on this? Do you have an article to back this up or anything? I mean, on what grounds are they protesting this coffee shop? Do you have any information on this, Mariah? I want to learn more about it. You know, before I just say something off the top of my head. So, you know, so there we go. Any information? Okay. Well, if someone can provide me more information about that, Mariah. They're Trotskyists. Okay. And if you have any information about why they're protesting this coffee shop, etc., I'd like to know more about it. You know, on the surface of it, it looks like this general wokeification, but we'll just have to hear about it. Abuse of U.S. as a reserve currency was exporting inflation to other countries. Now de-dollarization shall bring home the inflation. Life is hard. All right, we'll get to that. Yeah, I just want more information about the coffee shop. But I mean, it sounds like the general just woke boycotting of everyone who's not woke. So there we go. All right. All right. Do you have any tips on how to debunk the argument that communism is authoritarian. Well, I think it's not about pointing out that the U.S. is authoritarian. You have to point out that countries that are in those kinds of conditions will be authoritarian, right? That when countries are underdeveloped and countries are engaged in military confrontations, authoritarianism tends to be the results. That authoritarianism results from those kinds of conditions. So there you go. I think that's the important thing to remember there. Authoritarianism develops from those types of conditions. So, and that, there's just as many capitalist countries that are, facing the danger of communist revolution. And they also develop in an authoritarian manner. And the goal is to create a society with so much abundance and wealth that the need for a state itself fades away. And that the Soviet Union wasn't originally a one-party state. It had multiple political parties, but they were attacked, they were destabilized. One thing led to another. I think that's the important thing. All righty. Abuse of the U.S. as a reserve currency was exporting inflation to other countries. Now de-dollarization shall bring home the inflation. Life hard in the U.S. Yeah, I think that, again, the USA pushed it too far, right? They thought, well, we can make every country in the world use the dollar. We can use our control of the dollar to hurt other countries with the petrodollar, et cetera. And the result of that has been, we're going to see de-dollarization pretty soon. All right, folks. I'm going to be back tomorrow night. Not probably. I will be back tomorrow night with Rainer Shea. But I'm going to have to say goodnight for tonight. I've got a lot of other pressing things and got other things I have to take care of, but I wish you all the best for tonight. I'm going to put on the closing music and I'll be back tomorrow night with Rainer Shea. And, I think I'm going to be streaming with the chair of the Libertarian Party pretty soon. So yeah, should be good. So, all right. I'm going to put on the closing music and we're out. In the struggle against U.S. imperialism is now emerging throughout the world. Ever since World War II, U.S. imperialism and its followers have been continuously launching wars of aggression. But the people of various countries have been continuously waging revolutionary wars to defeat their aggression. While the danger of a new world war still exists, and the people of all countries must get prepared, revolution is the main trend in the world today.